Hello everyone and welcome to the first part of my videos on how I made Pow Pow for Slayer Jinx. Even though you're not making Pow Pow yourself, you might learn a thing or two that you can apply to other cosplays. So without further ado, let's get started. Here I'm cutting all the small parts out for, this thing.
I'm using a cardboard pipe for the base to glue all the parts on. For this part and almost the rest of Pow Pow, I'm building it up of EVA foam. I'm using a glue gun to glue all the parts on so I don't have to wait for the glue to dry. Before I would just eyeball all the parts, but after I'm starting to measuring them, I get a much better result. I'm using a ruler made of metal, so when I'm using my utility knife, it doesn't matter if it cuts in it. A tool that's really important to use is the Dremel. Before I would just use a scissor to cut off the edges, but with a Dremel you get much more sharper edges. Here I had just cut out some stripes of EVA foam. As I'm cutting them to where they should be, I'm giving them a letter, so afterwards when I have to glue them on, I'm sure I'm putting them on the right place. I'm cutting my stripes of EVA foam in half, since I don't want them to be too big. And even though it might take some extra time, it's worth using the Dremel on the edges afterwards. And then all what's left is to glue the parts on. Alright, moving on to this part. I don't know what to call it, but it's the same method as before, building it up of EVA foam. There's a lot of things I love about cosplay, but if there's one thing I really hate doing, it's cutting out circles. But we're gonna need 2 for this part, even though I drew out 3 of them. The 3 pipes I'm using came from tinfoil packages. I cut 3 holes in the 2 circles and glued them together, and now using the Dremel I'm making the edges smooth. Once we have Dremeled all the parts, we're gonna put Wobbler on it so it's gonna look really nice. Here I'm assembling all the parts with hot glue and making sure all the pipes still fits. Alright, let's move on to this square part thing. I'm using one of the circles from before to measure out so I'm sure it gets around the same size. Here's a tip that you might already be doing, but in case you don't, it's a good idea to always have a lot of pictures of the cosplays you're making. Sometimes you forget little details, so it's a good idea to have some pictures so you can always check that you got everything right. Another thing that I often forget is, when you're cutting out shapes, remember to turn them around when you're cutting after it. This way you have a clean surface on both sides. I'm gonna say this again, but it's really important to Dremel your parts. Even though this step takes a bit of extra time, it's really gonna be noticeable in the end. Before putting Wobbler on your triangles, make sure you have made the holes in them. This is gonna make it so much easier for you later. I find it easier to cut off the excess Wobbler while it's still warm. And don't waste too much time on making it perfect now, because we're gonna Dremel it anyway afterwards. While the Wobbler is still warm, I'm removing the excess Wobbler from the holes with my hands. I'm not gonna show me putting Wobbler on all the parts you just saw me make. I think you get the idea. And it's time to assemble all the parts, which I do by warming up the Wobbler and putting some extra glue on them. Once the part had been assembled, I spray painted it with silver paint. The pipes I was using weren't completely even, so I'm putting some layers of gesso on to cover up the holes. Even though this is a part for Fishbones and not Pow Pow, I just wanted to mention that it's a good idea to give a layer of transparent spray paint to seal your paint so it doesn't fall off later. Even though it has been painted with the silver spray paint, I give it a layer of silver acrylic paint. This way it's much easier to blend in the black acrylic paint, so you get a much smoother and natural looking result. Personally, I like acrylic paint much more than oil paint, since I think it's much easier to work with. To make the pipes look darker but not completely black, I cut out a piece of a sponge and gently dabbed some black paint on them. And with a pencil I made it look even darker on the upper and lower part of the pipes. Alright, let's move on to some details. You might not think it makes such a big difference, but painting a thin line of white paint is really gonna be noticeable. It's just like with the Dremel, it's a step that takes a lot of extra time, but in the end it's really gonna make a difference. The next step is to gently tap some white paint on the big surfaces. Alright, let's start working on, let's call it the body part of Pow Pow. As you can see, I'm using a quite big piece of EVA foam here. And by using a heat gun, it's much easier to bend. I cut out another stripe of EVA foam and glued them all together. And don't be sad if it doesn't look pretty, because we're gonna cover it anyway with these parts. And yeah, of course, it's time for the Dremel. Make sure the lower piece is a bit bigger than the upper piece. This way you can create an angle with the Dremel. Looks quite good so far. By dremeling an angle on the parts, it's gonna be easier to apply them later. Which you can see here what I'm talking about. Now that the angles has been created, it's time to glue the parts on. What I'm doing here is laying up with EVA foam, and then afterwards using the Dremel to give the shape I want. Again, I'm using the heat gun to warm up the material so it's easier to bend. Another thing I also like to do is heating up the glue again if it's dried. As you might have noticed, I'm changing clothes quite a lot of times. So I better warn you, if you're gonna make this cosplay, prepare yourself that it's gonna take a lot of days. And here I just cut out a part to close the body part. And moving on to the next part. I cut out 2 circles, glued them together, made holes in them, and now I'm using the Dremel on them. Nothing new here. Here I cut out a stripe of 2 layers of EVA foam. And again, making an angle makes the part fit much better together. Since you made it this far into the video, I'm assuming that you actually have an interest in seeing how the whole process worked. And for that, there's a video with part 2 and 3, so don't forget to check them out as well. But the last thing we're gonna do in this video is to make a hole where the big part we made earlier can fit in. And as you can see, if it wasn't big enough the first time, just cut a little bit more off the next time. And make sure you don't cut off too much. This is how far we got in this video, and remember to check out part 2. Thank you so much for watching. Please give the video a like if it was helpful to you. If you have any questions, please write them in the comments and I will answer them as good as I can.
See you guys next time for more Pow Pow crafting.